Hey folks, welcome to Between Awesome and Disaster. This is your host, Will Carey. Thank you guys so much for listening. I appreciate you being here. Again, if I sound like I'm a late night sex advice radio DJ, I have been coming down with a cold flu. It feels like a cold because I'm still up and about, but I'm managing. I've got some green tea, so I'm doing that whole thing. Thank you guys so much for the positive feedback and for listening to my recent rash of episodes with Frank Turner, with Mariel Loveland from Best X, and with my buddy Miles Hewitt. Those were some really great episodes, and I appreciate you guys for checking those out. On the show today, another comedian buddy of mine, comedian Gabe Pacheco, is on the show today. Gabe I knew from the Washington, D.C. Comedy scene. I started comedy in Baltimore, and I would occasionally go down to D.C. to do shows, usually with my friend Alex Powers, who I haven't seen in a while. Alex, if you're listening to this, I hope you're doing well. And Gabe is I've always known him, is a very friendly guy. His stand-up is very funny and also very socially aware without losing the jokes, which for political stuff, I that's something I'm sensitive to now in 2016. And this conversation, it was much more like current event oriented than I was expecting, but it kind of had to be through as I talked to Gabe, it made a lot of sense because a lot of Gabe's life growing up in the DC area is kind of informed by the social climate of the time, and as well as what his parents did for work. His mom, well, he'll tell you. I don't need to tell you all now in the intro. So I'm really excited to share this very interesting, thoughtful conversation I had with my buddy Gabe. If you enjoy this and you think you know somebody who might also enjoy listening to this show, you can tell friends. We are available everywhere you get your podcasts, including the big three, Apple, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can leave us a review or subscribe on those platforms. That helps other people find the show. And also, if you like my chat with Gabe, he has a movie podcast that he does called Eat, Pray, Judge, which is also available wherever you get your podcasts. So check out Eat, Pray, Judge by my guest Gabe today. And I'm on Twitter at Comic Will Carey if you want to follow me there. And thank you guys so much for listening. And let's go to my chat with Gabe Pacheco.
Darkest secret.
Well, that's I feel like that's the gold standard for most podcasting. Is
right.
you want people revealing their deepest, long hidden things, and then emailing you a week later to try and say, oh, can you cut out all the good stuff?
Can we commodify your pain, please, for my brand?
Exactly.
Yeah. I would like to engage in trauma tourism.
Oh, dark tourism.
Oh,
is that
I think
similar?
I just made that up as a thing. But yeah, sure, dark tourism. It's similar.
Well, did you ever see Dark Tourism on Netflix?
I saw the title. I haven't checked it out yet, but I'm a huge fan of that.
I've watched a few episodes. It's pretty interesting stuff. He goes and swims in Atomic Lake in the former Soviet Union, which is this lake that the Soviets created by detonating a nuclear bomb underground. And
they're the pressure pushed the aquifer, all the
Yes.
water up, but the water is now.
Yeah, and that's how they made this giant hole. And I think that, I don't know if they filled it in, but there's fish in there, and they eat some of the fish they catch. And it's one of those things it's safe to swim in this part, but don't go down too deep because then that's not safe. I don't know exactly why.
I get that. Maybe radioactivity is kind of like a vinegar and oil in a salad dressing, and the vinegar settles at the bottom, and
Sure.
perhaps so does the radioactivity, and then the top layer of the water in the lake is just pristine.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a orange juice with pulp. If you don't shake it up right away, it all settles.
Yeah, I love Chernobyl, by the way. That was such a great show.
Yeah, I loved that show.
And honestly, it just made me almost faux nostalgic for something that I'd never experienced, which was the Soviet system.
Uh-huh.
But I didn't watch that and think of the Soviet system as somehow wrong or flawed. I saw it as a metaphor for global warming, and that we actually need a strong government that's willing to just throw resources at solving the problem.
Yeah.
Like with the Soviet system, they were like, oh, you mean there's going to be a meltdown that's going to take out half of the continent? Okay, what do you need?
Right.
Let's do that.
Yeah, I liked that part of it. I also liked how, because I had forgotten that Chernobyl happened like 3 days after I was born. So it's basically most of my existence is post Chernobyl. So this whole idea of gross incompetence leading to a absolutely catastrophic, world-altering disaster is an idea that weighs like heavily on me.
Sure.
and then when you just saw like them flying over the reactor, and then the helicopters just keep dropping. It's like, well, we got to put it out. So if you could just fly in there, fly in, drop it. It's very unsettling to me, but in like a really entertaining way.
Yeah. I think that gross incompetence and sort of bureaucratic corruption is not unique to the Soviet system, though.
I don't think it is either.
And so it's interesting that I never want to project onto someone else or another culture as though they're somehow worse or more incompetent than us. Like The Big Short is a film that kind of shows exactly how our own system can be gamed, and how it kind of there's no experts at the top who really know how things are going.
Yeah, I watched it and just thought, wow, this kind of thing, it just keeps happening. And I wanted to ask you this, because I've had this feeling lately, because I've been in the world of stand-up comedy for, this will be my 12th year this month.
Yeah.
In the world of doing comedy and like paying attention to comedy. Do you ever feel like, when it comes to like social stuff, like the kind of common topics that like get talked about on political shows, or like the people's political bits, do you ever think, we already solved this? I've heard this bit, and I have my thought. I have my thought on this idea. Why are we continuing to keep debating this? Why can't we get past it and focus on something else? Do you ever have that feeling?
Well, I think it's interesting. Just scroll through anyone's tweets or the old controversies from 2014 or 2010, and you'll just see the whatever that hot button issue was, and how laughable it is by what's going on right now.
Right.
And then these things come back, and I think it depends on the stakes. What are the stakes at the moment in time? Is it an existential crisis, or is it are women funny yet? Like that will come back, I'm sure, after Trump's presidency.
Sure. That's one of those things where I'm just like, yes. Asked and answered.
Yeah.
Let's talk about something else.
Do you remember, Mom's Mabley? Do you remember Lucille Ball? Do you remember, you can go back to the origins of comedy and film, or in recorded comedy, and there's always women that have been, icons.
Yeah. But then like the same, and then I feel like the same issues get addressed, like, gay rights or the right to choose. Like, I figured all that out, and I'm just waiting for the world to catch up with me. I feel sometimes like I already know the answer. Why isn't everyone else caught up on the answer also?
I think the flaw in civilization is that people die. Civilization can't deal with death or birth. And every generation kind of figures things out to a degree, but then they have kids, and then those kids, and they have experts, and the experts die, and so new people have to take the reins. But then also kids don't know everything, and I think I remember my mother at one point saying to me, she was like, "Oh, I forgot that you weren't that like." She didn't know that she assumed I knew things that there's no way I could know, because I hadn't lived her whole experience.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah,
So
I think-
I remember her driving me around San Francisco once because that's where she was before I was born. She lived in the Mission District with my dad. And she's talking to me about the People's Temple. Like Jim Jones was operating the People's Temple around the time that she was in San Francisco. And she talked to me about the Black Panthers in San Francisco at that time. And Angela Davis, and just talking about like my dad, like, you know, doing acid at a Santana concert in Berkeley, right? And all these fun sort of experiences that they had, but that they it's like they almost assume that I'd experienced those things with them, even though I wasn't born until like 20 years later. So it's
Right,
like,
right. Yeah, I've spent some time in the Mission District. There's some great food, great stuff going on. In that part of San Francisco. Yeah, and I think that happens, assuming that it's sort of like when you're writing a book report and you get like this is incomplete. And then you're like, well, you're asking me things the teacher already knows. I'm like, well, you can't write the report. Like, you think you know what the teacher knows. You think you know what the teacher knows. I feel like that's where sometimes the conversation on big things breaks down over the internet, because everyone is operating from their own experiences, and it gets very defensive very quickly when going back and forth in short blips.
Oh man, totally. Well, the internet is based on hyperbolic yes or no's. Everything's black and white, and you know, everyone's brand is having a point of view, a strong point of view. And we found a way to. It feels almost puritanical, where like if you disagree with someone on any specific topic, then that means that your whole worldview must be wrong.
Yeah.
At least within the framework of like a Twitter or an online, some sort of online back and forth in the comment thread. I don't think I'm not saying that this is the case in real conversations.
Yeah, I don't think it's the case in real conversations.
Yeah, in real conversations you can have nuance and body language.
Yeah,
and irony.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to pick up on those subtle nuances, and you're also not you're going to maintain a basic level of politeness and decency, because you know that there are certain lines that you could cross in a debate or conversation that if you go too far could result in the other person wanting to punch you in the face and deciding to act on it.
Yeah. I mean, the internet allows for anonymity, and that is the thing. That's where people lose empathy and I don't want to say manners, because who cares about manners? But they lose any sense of civility. I don't
disagree with you. That's why I like doing these, because you get to have those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So your mom was in San Francisco for like years before you were born.
That's right.
And then I want to trace this a little bit. So what was she like? And so that era of San Francisco, I'm imagining this is like the 60s.
This is the 70s through like 78.
Okay, so 70s from 70s. So even still, country's a very different place. There's still like a lot of like flower power is dead. You know, peace and love, you know, died at Altamont at that Rolling Stones concert.
It's interesting when people talk about things like that, though, because like when we, let's say we take a moment like 68 and then you have Charlie, the Manson murders, and then you have Altamont. But I think that these cultural, we live in the culture for longer than the history books say. Like I'm still listening to rap from 2000. So even though like that era of rap is over, that doesn't mean that people aren't continuing to like be informed by that. And
totally.
Yeah.
I'm
so I
still
feel
listening to pop punk from the early 2000s.
Right. So what, you know, it's like, did it really end? Did those things end? So
not for me.
Yeah. And I think that San Francisco was still this hotbed of left thought and sort of progressive ideas.
And kind of like free form artistic expression. I always view San Francisco as this hotbed for like indulging whatever kind of creative impulse you had, despite how crazy it might be.
Yeah, I don't know if there's crime in San Francisco right now, with Silicon Valley basically taking over the city. But it's but you know, my parents said that it was rough in the Mission at that time. There was like a lot of gang activity. You know, just there's a lot of poverty as well. So, and a lot of crime, I think, is just like symptoms of poverty. So it was just a rougher, they made it sound like it was a rougher experience. and they were around a lot of interesting, fun, weird people.
And what kind of types were they? Were they creative people?
My mom was a lawyer. She worked for the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and so MALDEF is what short that. And she was kind of working in the civil rights movement at the time, helping desegregate schools.
Oh,
and then there's like a lot of de facto segregation in schools as well. When you look at tracking, like you have the gifted and talented programs are basically just like reinforcing old Jim Crow ideas. Like once you desegregate schools, then you create special ed, special needs classes, and then so there's de facto segregation that occurs after you get rid of it.
Sure. just by unconsciously or sometimes maybe consciously.
Yeah, I mean they just find ways to make the systemic separation of people seem colorblind by picking other factors.
Right, of course. And then like economic factors all become like coded ways of it being race related without having to actually say it.
Totally. Well, you look at like school districts, how neighborhoods are zoned, and you like basically have a neighborhood with with higher property value, and then the higher property value gets taxed higher, and then those schools have better funding.
Yeah.
And so the scramble is to try to get into those districts. And I was doing real estate in New York for a minute, which
really?
There's so many hustles that you have to have if you're an artist in this city. And I don't regret having done it, but I also probably wouldn't do it now for ethical reasons.
Sure.
But I was like in The Wire, the corner boys, like the lowest rung of real estate. I was an agent who I posted ads on Craigslist. People would call me, and then I would show up at a place with keys and let them see it. So I wasn't a broker. I worked under brokers.
Right. You were Saul Goodman before he was Saul Goodman.
Yeah.
Well, you were the Saul Goodman of real estate.
It's like the mob. Like real estate is set up exactly like the mob, where like Tony Soprano gets a taste from all of his underlings and all of the profits they make. So like any deals that I made, like I'd have to kick up money to the agent, who's the licensed person, who gets all of the apartments for us to show. And I remember I was showing apartments in this area of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and there's like a school there that has it has a track for bilingual, like a French language track, and all of these parents were desperately trying to get apartments in the district to go to that school.
Yeah.
And I'd also gone there as a teaching artist, so I'd gone there to work with the kids. And what I can say is that the second grade class that was like not tracked, that was just mainstream, that was a much more diverse group of kids with a teacher who had 30 years of experience and was awesome.
Right.
And then the French track, they had like a first year teacher who maybe had a master's degree in French, but didn't know how to teach. And that room was full of wild ass, like totally entitled lunatic children.
Right.
And so on paper, that class looked better, but in reality, that class was like
just
trash.
The shit.
It's like, and knowing that as a parent, I'd be like, oh man, I'd rather have my kid in the mainstream class than the one that gets the accolades.
Exactly. No, yeah, that makes total sense to me, because I definitely feel like, I definitely know some people who come from places. Overused phrase, but come from places of privilege or just not having that base experience of having to fight and claw for something, and then it's just kind of there. So yeah, you totally don't know what you totally take it for granted, and as a result, when you're younger, especially, I've observed you're kind of shit. You're kind of a shitty person. So I find, isn't it interesting how the structure, the like ranking and structure of Cosa Nostra has pervaded into other aspects of the world as the mob has declined in influence. Like, I feel like comedy is that way also, where you make your, like, you got to make your bones on something. Then it's like, oh, this he's a friend of ours. Oh, he's funny. Okay, you go be funny here. I was like, oh, you're pretty funny there. Why don't you go be funny up on this slightly hard on this stage? Why don't you go be funny on this stage? I feel like it's all like handshake kind of
Well, yeah, it's so. I mean, this is this game is all about your reputation. I don't know anything, but my perception is that it's about reputation, credits, and how many personal relationships you have.
Yeah.
And but then what also makes it challenging is that every 6 months there's a brand new crop of people who are coming in.
Yep.
And also the world is constantly changing, so the zeitgeist is changing. And with that, whatever the culture war or thing that you were exploring 4 years ago might not be relevant today.
Yeah, you're suddenly like we've heard this at a million open mics, and that's like you're the tired hack at the open mic. It's so insidious how that can happen.
So I mean, you just have to stay. You have to stay on top of everything.
Yeah.
In this,
I think so. And the other thing is you can't be completely closed off to change. Because I feel like I feel like there are comics that are very funny, but they are just it's just kind of the one thing they're doing, and they've got their people that like it. But there's if you are completely resistant to how the zeitgeist is changing and evolving, and you don't want to do that. Or you can't. That's how you end up getting left behind. Like I think, like when you ever go to the comic strip and you see all those headshots, and you recognize like a handful of them, and then there are all those names. They're like, oh, what sad story is with that person, or what was their life? What is this person's life? Because they're on this wall, so they were clearly funny, but I've never heard of them. And are they alive? What are they doing now?
Yeah. Did they get? They got married. They had kids. They got a job. They moved away. They got sick. Sad thing. I always feel like we've got a limited amount of time here, and we're blessed for every moment as performers to be able to get on the stage and entertain audiences, because something's going to happen to you.
Yeah, basically, it's all very finite.
It's like in Fight Club. It's like on a long enough timeline, your chance of survival is zero.
Yeah, and and comedy especially, because you can ascend to the top of the mountain in comedy and be gone immediately based on so many different factors. It's of course like stuff that comes out that you did that was fucked up, or something you said that was fucked up. But it could just all go. I feel like it can all go away very quickly, or you could just stay around, and then suddenly like people move on.
That's right, and you're the oldest guy at the mic.
Yeah.
Or you just haven't kept up, and you don't know how to use TikTok.
I don't know how to use TikTok. All I know is that it's apparently similar to Vine.
Yeah,
that's all I know about it. So I kind of want to. So I want to trace this a little bit, because I feel like I remember you from like the DC area.
Well, I was, I grew up in D.C. That's where I was raised. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in the city limits near the National Zoo and Adams Morgan in a neighborhood called Woodley Park.
Okay.
And I think I had a very unique upbringing, and it feels. I think the more I think about it, the stranger it is as I get older, because D.C. only had like 400,000 people in it. And it was a very segregated city growing up, and I grew up during the 80s there, so it was like the heavy crack era,
right?
And
the Marion Barry era.
Totally.
Yeah.
And there's a great documentary about him, The 9 Lives of Marion Barry, which is fantastic, because I remember him as a kid when he got caught smoking crack, and like my white friends' parents were like, "Hey, he's a terrible man, whatever, like what a terrible guy, I can't believe it." And then my black friends' parents were like, well, and I was like, how can this be so polarizing? Why is this an issue? And then watching this documentary, I looked back into his history and how he was like, a civil rights leader right up there with with Martin Luther King and with Jesse Jackson. And he was like had a PhD in molecular biology. So he's like this Southern dude who's like politically active, and he's also borderline. That's like genius shit. That's very difficult science to worry about and tackle and explore. And then he comes to DC, and he's a community activist in DC. He's rocking dashikis, looking like Lando Calrissian. He's just doing his thing, and then he gets elected to like local government, where a group of radical Muslim protesters, I don't know what I don't want to call them terrorists, but these guys like take over a government building and shoot him. He gets shot in the chest with a shotgun, survives that. So as in his role as a public servant, takes bullets in this chaos and this civil unrest. And so he had all of this goodwill, becoming mayor.
Yeah.
And so that is like, now he's at the peak. And then it's like, once he became mayor, it's free. I think it was a huge alcohol problem that he had. He's out there schmoozing every day.
Yeah, which is part of the game in DC.
Which is a huge, like, my parents, we grew up in DC, like I said, and my parents, every night of the week, there was a different event that they were invited to go to.
And your mom was still a lawyer?
Yeah, so she's a lawyer in D.C., and my dad worked for Health and Human Services in D.C.
Okay, so like public sector.
Oh yeah. We were all no private contractors. They didn't work for Raytheon or like any.
Gotcha. I love like political shows on TV, so I'm putting together the narrative in my head as you're telling me what they are. So an event or a fundraiser or something every night.
Yeah, and so their dance cards were always full, and especially my dad. My mother less because she was in the private sector as a lawyer after a while. She's an immigration lawyer, and that informed me growing up a lot too, because we always had people from all over the world in the house. And typically people from places where things weren't going well.
Sure.
So if there's a genocide happening where you're from, oh man, you're coming over. You're hanging out at the house. We always had people from all over the world. And my dad, we had an open door policy, so there was always someone visiting from somewhere. And that was part of my education too. Just meeting people from El Salvador or Mexico or ethnic Chinese people from Indonesia.
I really envy that, because I grew up in a very, like, an hour and a half south of DC, and I don't know if you know Calvert County.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know if
more snow days.
A lot of snow days.
Yeah.
So Calvert County, pretty white.
Yeah.
So I didn't I feel like I became I started getting exposed to like the world much later on than other people. Like my fiance was born and raised in Brooklyn. So just like, going to school and having your Indian friend, your not just your and not just like your black friend, but your like South African friend or your Korean friend, your Japanese friend. Like I had Ben. And Ben was great. Ben is awesome.
But there's a lot of pressure on Ben.
Exactly, a lot of pressure on Ben. Ben's got to answer questions for not just where his family, but like families that aren't even his.
Yeah, he's got to sing.
We're all idiots.
He's singing all the animatronic puppets from It's a Small World After All.
But that was like a part of like just seeing like how other people lived and like hearing about other people's lives.
Yeah, that was just the water that I was swimming in. So I don't know if it wasn't like an ideological thing or anything. It's just that I was just surrounded by diverse people.
Yeah.
And then growing up in the city, I went to private schools in DC in that area. And what's interesting is that those schools, even the ones that are in the city, like Sidwell was up the street from me. That's where Chelsea Clinton went to school. That's where the Obama daughters went. And National Cathedral, that's where Al Gore's daughter went, and St. Albans. So I was in that area. But a lot of those kids, those very privileged kids, and I was incredibly privileged to be there. But they, a lot of them were commuted into the city from the suburbs to go to these marquee schools. And it was interesting how I living in the city in like a nice neighborhood, the prejudice that they had of the city, as though the moment that once my friends from Maryland and Virginia got cars, their parents were like, oh yeah, you can drive anywhere you want, you just can't drive into DC. Because crossing that border was somehow crossing this magical line where, like, nothing but crack and violence were gonna welcome you.
Mm-hmm.
And so there, I just got to see how insidious these prejudices are, that don't really like the fears that people have don't make any sense.
Yeah.
And my friends in the suburbs were the ones that were like doing the wildest shit.
Oh yeah.
Like the first time I saw people like using a beer bong was in Reston, Virginia, which is like a planned, safe community. All the people I knew who were like just shoveling cocaine up their nose were like all out in Maryland.
Yeah. That's I that I think is some of that I always thought of was a reaction to just boredom. And especially if you have this inaccurate view of the city as like, oh, like the second you get on the Beltway, you just get stabbed and cracked. You get cracked up real good. I always thought that was a reaction to because my hometown definitely there was lots of those kinds of like the house parties, and there's like always drinking and driving was a big thing. Like a kid in my graduating class died before we graduated.
Yeah.
And they had his like cap and gown on an empty chair as we were all graduating. So that was always kind of around. But I was just like, I rode the bus all through from like sixth grade to like senior year of high school.
Yeah.
And my wild time was like, ooh, I'm gonna play Metal Gear Solid again. But yeah, so that's that dichotomy is always very interesting to me too. And then that starts the like the like elite club. Those elite kind of clubs of like people that just kind of help each other out and like vouch for each other and give each other jobs and look out for each other's shitty behavior.
What do you mean? Continue.
I'm imagining the wild suburban parties are how you breed like the Brett Kavanaughs of the world.
I was thinking about him exactly. Yeah, like I just remember those kids. Like, I'd go to a St. Albans party up the street and I'd see those and I'm like, oh, those are the ones.
Right.
The varsity jacket boys.
Yeah, I know the exact kind of person. So what circles were you running in like during this time? Like when you get to like I don't know, high school school age, like who are you in this environment?
In high school, I went to an all-boys Catholic school, which was pretty fun for a while. And I really liked it because that it was it was the nerdy one. It was where all the kids wore turtlenecks and had bowl cuts, and it was not the competitive sports. Our like number one sport was cross country.
Yep. Yeah, that is if I have to think about physical activities that get called nerdy, I think long distance running's up there.
Yeah, we were like so I was doing stage crew.
For like theater?
Yeah.
Oh,
we had a Latin club. There I got to do some AV stuff for like projects. I remember some of the earliest creative projects that I got to do was in one of my Latin classes in 6th grade. We had to do reports on different emperors. So me and 2 friends, we decided we were going to do a video on the life and times of Emperor Nero. So 3 6th grade boys, making a pretty graphic, a middle school version of the film Caligula, and they just let us do that, which was amazing. And then I made another video like that with another friend on the Trials of Hercules. So these were like early forays with video cameras into some sketch comedy. And I think that it was a really my favorite years of school were maybe 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Because that's when I went to this all boys school. And it was like before puberty, before everyone's and I went to a co-ed high school after that, and I have to say, like, what was interesting was that at the all boys school, it didn't matter how nerdy you were or how good at sports you were. There was this egalitarian flavor to. There was nothing that we were competing for.
Right.
It was like, oh, are you good at drawing? Okay, let's like draw. Like, so everyone could draw. Everyone tried to play sports. Everybody tried to do stuff. And then I went to this co-ed school for the last 2 years of high school, and everybody was so much dumber. And not because they were dumb people, but because the rules of engagement made everybody act dumber around each other.
Sure. Yeah.
And like the lacrosse players mattered. Like it was like sports mattered in a way that they'd never had before.
Right.
I was like, none of this, the hierarchies seemed so absurd to me. I was like, oh, I'm in Saved by the Bell now. I've never experienced this before.
Yeah. It's like, oh, all of the cliche cliques from the Breakfast Club.
Yeah.
They exist. Lacrosse, I've never. Lacrosse is like the like state sport of Maryland.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, why? It's on ESPN2 if you're lucky.
Sure. I wonder, well, do lacrosse players, is it a way to get a scholarship to an Ivy League school?
It must be, because it's like, I guess it's considered more like refined, but still, it's refined but tough. So like, maybe they look down on people who get high school scholarships. It's like, oh, that's what the poors do. They get their football scholarship. On the other hand, I combine baskets and there's no tackling.
It's a native indigenous sport to the United States. So.
Oh, it is.
Yeah,
we invented. We
didn't invent it. Like the Seneca invented it, or like the Lenape or the Iroquois.
Right. Well, it made me think of that there was like an ancient game that the Mayans played.
Yeah.
Where you basically you were trying to hit with your hip a ball through a hoop to avoid like having to be sacrificed to the gods.
Yeah, that so an experience I had that blew me away was going to Mexico City. I think I was like 20 years old, and I went to Mexico City, and I love history, and growing up in Washington D.C., we have all the free museums.
Oh yeah,
learning all about the founding fathers, going to Monticello, going to the different plantations that these dudes owned, and where they didn't really talk about the slave quarters at all.
Yeah,
or the rapes.
Yeah,
which you can say that they had mistresses, but if you're having sex with enslaved people, you're a rapist.
Yeah,
masters
basically
are rapists. So
I mean, yeah, it's not like your slave is going to say no and you're going to be like, oh, okay, I respect your boundaries.
That's right.
I don't think that happens.
Yeah, so that's always kind of whitewashed.
Yeah, they gloss over that. I definitely remember not realizing like the cliche thing is like, oh, like you go home for Thanksgiving, you're like, this holiday is how we celebrate how we took this country from the Native Americans, and that's like your freshman year of college.
Yeah.
Do you have so being in DC and going to museums, do you remember having a moment when you realized that there's this dark side to American history? When did that happen for you?
I think it happened in I always saw. I love that my father, he would tell me things like we'd like see homeless people on the street, and then he'd be like, "What's up? What happened to that guy?" And I'm like, "He's a victim of his circumstances." And he was like, "Exactly." Like, so there was this idea that we don't have, as much as we like to believe in this myth of personal responsibility, and that we can all, each of us can strive and overcome, that there are systemic things that are in place that kind of crush people's spirits and
sure
put them down. And I think we would drive a lot through the neighborhoods in DC, and so I knew, and when my dad worked for the city government, a lot of his coworkers, he was like the only Latino in one of his offices, so all of his coworkers were African American, and I got to see this, like, the African Americans were in charge, but also in extreme poverty within the same city. So I got to see this, like, that none of the prejudices, none of the stereotypes are real. And I was like, why is the city like this? And my dad was like, well, because the budget is not controlled by the government in the city. There is this is like an internal colony that doesn't have any representation. So he's like, DC is a colony, and we're living in this colony.
And how old were you when he told you that?
I think I was probably like 11 or 12.
Uh-huh.
And my parents also didn't like, they were Democrats. So like we're in DC and there's like was graffiti up that said Meese is a pig, and Meese was one of his secretaries. So I'm like, who's that guy? So I'm like learning all this stuff, or like we're watching the Iran-Contra affair on TV, and they're talking about Oliver North. And we have people in my house from El Salvador, and they were escaping the civil war in El Salvador. So I'm very directly seeing U.S. empire taking place. Like, why are there refugees in our house? Oh, because Ronald Reagan has sent is funding death squads that are killing like people in villages. So historically, I didn't understand any of this stuff, but I saw the injustice happening around me, but I didn't have an ideological framework to put that in.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about like, when did I start seeing this historically? I had a friend who was like, hey, in high school, he's like, DC it was founded on a crooked land deal. It was a compromise. So like the real capital of the United States could have been Philadelphia or New York. But Thomas Jefferson said, well, I want to give the South more power. We need to give these slave masters more power. So why don't we have a compromise and give half of Maryland and half of Virginia? We'll give this diamond-shaped plot of land with the Potomac cutting it in half.
Yeah.
And we'll make that the nation's capital. And since it's a swamp, no one will want to be there. And so it will really minimize the power of the federal government. And then once Maryland started building their part, Jefferson and Virginia went back on their promise for land.
Right.
So even within that in that compromise, these like Southern slave owners were like disingenuous from the very beginning.
Oh yeah.
And I that made me think, like, I live in the nation's capital, and the nation's capital is like this was founded on this compromise in this swamp.
Yeah. It's a very unstable foundation with which to build a democracy.
And I think I read Gore Vidal's Burr. That was the book, I think, that started me on this path of like looking at a revision of American history.
Yeah, because it's always won by the people who win, so they get to there. That's the, and of course you never want to present the difficult shades of gray version of your country's history, because that is a more difficult class after the field trip.
Or like I remember watching like a movie on the Alamo with my dad, and walking through the room, and I like loved cowboys and Indians, like playing games like that.
Sure,
I had
sure.
Cowboy and Indian toys, and my grandparents, they lived in Wyoming for a while, so I'd spend time out there, and there's like a big cowboy culture. So I'm like watching this Alamo and like rooting for, I don't know, Sam Houston or whatever, and my dad's like, why aren't you rooting for the Mexicans? Or like,
right.
Why do you see them as the villains in this? Like, these fucking cowboys came in and decided to steal this land, and this Mexican army is just fighting to maintain their borders.
Right. I remember this reminds me of conversations I've had with my dad, who's a pretty conservative guy. I remember him. I'm trying to accurately remember the context of this. It somehow revolved around World War II, and specifically the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I don't remember exactly what point he was making or what he was responding to, but he's basically said that Japan was complaining because we kicked their butts in World War II and that they should get over it. That was probably one of the first points where I was like, hold the phone. And then I was like, oh, okay. So they attacked a military base, and then we leveled to civilian populations. Okay. And then
and then that old George, the closing bit on George Carlin's final special is like, oh, if you think you have rights, go to Wikipedia and type in Japanese Americans 1945, learn all about your rights, and then just seeing like, oh, okay, yeah, this is fucked up history that you kind of got to own. You kind of got to accept the bad with the good, and it's not as comforting as living in absolutes, but it's important to be able to do that.
It just feels more interesting too. Like I have a dark sensibility, a dark sense of humor. I'd rather, I like the truth, or whatever. I'd rather hear a story that's got more shades of gray to it.
Yeah,
I don't need to be comforted. So
exactly. Yeah, I have food for comfort. I don't need warm false truths.
Well, so the reason I brought up Mexico very quickly is like, my family's from Mexico, but I went there when I was around 20 to Mexico City, and like I said, I was really into the founding fathers. I studied AP history. I was drinking up all of this history about the United States, and then going to Mexico City, I was like, wow, it was the first time that I realized that in North America there was it's a mega metropolis. Like, it puts U.S. cities to shame.
Right.
It's the biggest city in North America. It's and it's older than any city we have. So it's like the Rome of North America. Yeah. But we don't think about it at all.
To be honest, I've never been. Want to go, never been.
But there's like temples there that are, precede our country by 1,000 years. So that's wild. That idea that the founding fathers and this idea that we have this sort of democracy that we built here in the United States is this tabula rasa. It's sort of like before the 13 colonies there was nothing. Is kind of the way that we teach you history. Yes. But that's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, I agree completely. So you studied AP history. Did you go to school for like history, or I feel like you strike me because your work is very socially aware, and I thought, and I'm curious. You strike me as someone who definitely, you feel like you majored in political science.
Oh yeah.
Did you?
That's what I did major in.
I called that so good.
I don't know why this became a political podcast right now.
Dude, this is what I love. We got time to talk about comedy. This is the kind of conversation neither of us could have planned out, but it's happening, and I dig it.
Well, before I started stand up, one of the special I watched that blew me away was Eddie Izzard's special, where he just basically goes through European history for an hour and a half in drag.
Oh,
and he's like, yes. The Romans, and then the flags, and then the colonists, they took land with flags. And that was so cool because he was not, all of his humor was just mining the past.
Yeah, and he was definitely the first comic I ever saw to really do that, to make your history book really funny.
Right. And Stonehenge with the henges and druids. Yeah. What is it? It's a henge. So, I don't know if I haven't watched him in years, but that that opened some the possibility of making jokes that were outside of observational comedy.
Yeah. And had you were you a fan of stand-up before you found that special, or were you paying attention to it at all?
The first stand-up specials that tickled me were in college when I got a CD of Chris Rock's Born a Suspect. And then immediately after that, Bring the Pain sort of came onto the scene. So to see that quantum leap in quality from Born a Suspect to Bring the Pain.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. It's like night and day.
So he was my favorite comic for a year, probably around that. And then I thought, well, who brought Chris Rock onto the scene? Oh, Eddie Murphy. Okay, well, Eddie Murphy had these specials that were big in the 80s, but I wasn't really paying attention. So then I went back and I watched Delirious and I watched Raw, and then from there I thought, well, who else was like who do I like? I used to love watching Richard Pryor movies on like Channel 5 in DC or Channel 50. So not his stand up but his movies, and I was like, okay, well, Eddie Murphy says Chris Rock. No, he says Richard Pryor, and he also says Bill Cosby. So then I watched Richard Pryor and Bill Cosby, and I'm like smoking weed in the dorm, and and I'm watching all these guys in a row, and I'm thinking, oh, they're all having a conversation with each other. Like that was the feeling I had, was like every one of these is like a direct response to the person who came before. So I saw stand up as this sort of living oral tradition that where you just want to comment on what those who came before you have done, but make it better or different.
Yeah, I think I could see that, especially with those comics.
Those specific comics.
I loved your trace of that, because that's like how I did the same. I was doing the same thing with music before I got into stand up. I was like, okay, Blink-182. Okay, what did Blink-182 like? The Descendants. Okay, who are the Descendants like? Okay, and eventually you get to like Minor Threat and DOA and all that stuff.
Yeah, and punk rock was a huge influence as well for me, and my sensibilities, because before comedy, I loved late 70s, early 80s West Coast hardcore, because so the Dead Kennedys, Fear, the Circle Jerks, and early Black Flag, and the Descendants, X, and the Vandals, and X. They all had songs that took the perspective of the bad guy, or they all were like just laden with irony. Yeah. And where you could look at it either way. So like an example is like Black Flag's A White Minority. Right? So that could come off as like hate speech, right? Because it's a song about how white people are going to like become the minority in the United States. But it's a Puerto Rican singer who's singing it, and it's about that fear, but it's not. Yeah,
it's like goading it's like goading its intended target.
Yeah, and it's channeling this hateful ideology and making it and crystallizing it for everyone to see, as this is the ideology of the fearful white of white supremacy. And or the Dead Kennedy, or what is it? Circle Jerks had a song about building the bomb, like where he talks from the perspective of an engineer who like builds the bombs in one of these Sunbelt suburban like neighborhoods, and he's the dad who's like a happy dad, but he's like feeding the war machine by making these bombs. Or any Dead Kennedy song. Oh yeah. When they say kill the poor, they don't mean it.
Yeah, they don't really mean kill the poor, but that's like what that's what the rich feel like they want to do. Yeah, I imagine.
Or Fear is like the OG edgelords. That band is so. It's hard to like justify them today, but like listening to that when I was 14 was like, oh, these guys are awesome.
Yeah, I would put Darby Crash in that same category also. I feel like the Germs were like. Of a similar vein. I'm sure there's someone who will hear this and say I'm an idiot, but whatever. That man, I had no idea we had so many. We had some shared interest in punk rock and hardcore music. That's sure. That's rad, man. Because absolutely. Like tracing like prior to like Eddie Murphy, they're flipping the finger to the establishment mainstream culture in their own way. And the great thing about Eddie Murphy is I think he more so Delirious, I think, but I can't I'm not going to defend like his use of the word faggot, but like tucking in all of that kind of like youthful subversion in the context of like the family barbecue bit or the ice cream truck, I think is very much keeping in with that aesthetic of punk.
Yeah. And he, I mean, his comedy gets dated as well. So like it's very difficult to say, hey, go listen to Bill Hicks because it made sense when I heard it, but I heard it in the late 90s. So
I feel that way about Lenny Bruce. I'm too far removed from the time to appreciate how genius he was.
that's right. Well, I think he liberated people from set up punchline and made it feel as though you could do stream of consciousness comedy. And he liberated it too from sort of the theatricality of someone like who's doing like a phone call bit.
Right. Yeah, almost like I'm imagining Carlin's AM FM, like where he basically like wrote his eulogy to his old persona.
Yeah.
And started doing what he really wanted to do. So was Eddie Izzard the comic that made you want to be a comic? What made you want to be a comedian?
Okay. Well, I was teaching in New York City's public schools.
And what grade were you teaching?
I was teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th grade science. And I worked with the new, what is it? What are they called? The New York City Teaching Fellows. So I joined that organization, which I do not co-sign. I don't co-sign Teach for America or the Teaching Fellows. I think it's a cool track to get in if you want to be a teacher, but it's ultimately they feel like union busting organizations and who are teaching like indoctrinating teachers with like pretty corporate neoliberal ideas. Yes. So, but I wanted to move to New York desperately after college, and I was living in my parents' basement. The war had just started in the Iraq War, which I was like 100% against at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. I had like a Iraqi apologist show up at my college. I went to Bard College, which is a pretty left-leaning school.
Sure, yeah.
But I had this guy show up who was just like, all these sanctions against Iraq are creating mass death among the kids, and there's like depleted uranium everywhere, and the water supply is poisoned. And Iraq was one of the few places in the Middle East where women were professionals, and it was a secular society, and they had socialized medicine. So yeah, were a bunch of problems with Iraq, but relative to the other governments in the area, it was not the worst,
right,
by far. So I'd come home and I'd be like, why did we go to what happened with Desert Storm, And my mom would be like, what are you talking about? Like, Saddam gassed the Kurds. He's a terrible man. And I was skeptical of maybe he did. But we just co-signed Syria to go kill Kurds. So
yeah,
I don't really understand why we look at one of these things as a reason to invade, and another one is we're totally fine with it.
Yeah, it's very, very unusual how those decisions get made.
So I'm in D.C. and I'm living in my parents' basement, and everyone else in D.C. is an intern who can't wait to like work for the Bush administration. All the other 20-year-olds are like just total squares.
Yeah,
that love being Republicans. And I wanted to leave desperately because there was no art scene really that I knew of. So all my friends were living in Williamsburg, and at that time Williamsburg had these like the 2-story bicycle riders, and it looked like it was like Portlandia. So I thought, okay, I'll join the Teaching Fellows, and I didn't want to be a teacher after a while, but what I felt like was I wasn't doing anything that I wanted to do. I felt like I was becoming a warden or like a security guard.
Sure.
And I liked the kids, but I didn't feel like I was expressing my authentic self in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So I started going to open mics.
Where was your first one?
Oh, the first one was at Ha Comedy Club.
Yes. Ha Comedy Club.
In Times Square at the time. And I think what I saw was there's this playwright, TV writer named Nick Jones. And I went to college with him, but Nick Jones, he was, I went to see a play that he put on at the Bowery Poetry Cafe. And it was a puppet rock opera. So I'm going down to the Bowery Poetry Cafe from where I lived in Washington Heights.
And that place was on the Lower East Side.
That's right.
Yeah, so long train ride.
So long train ride, and I'm like taking like prescription pain pills to like just dull my senses at school. and I was dating a really nice woman, but it was like a loveless thing where like that's
you're
ending.
So you were just in a bad place.
Yeah, that's ending. I'm self-medicating. I'm not enjoying my relationship. I'm seeing a dead end to like my career as a science teacher.
Uh-huh.
And then I go down to the Bowery Poetry Cafe and I see this guy I went to school with putting on this amazing play with puppets and rock music. And I was like, what am I doing?
Right.
I'm still in my 20s. Let's give it a shot.
Totally,
Let's
man.
become part of the art scene in New York.
Yeah. Absolutely, man. I remember being just so, once I discovered stand up as like my thing, because I was just that moment when you find the thing is quite freeing. Because I remember I was going to school for theater, but I was never going to be the lead. I was never going to be the leads and things. And then when I found stand up as my thing that I could do that no one else, not even like the leads, people getting the leads in the plays could do.
Yeah.
I felt like I kind of found like my thing. And then I just like New York was on my mind. And I just remember being really relieved. Even when early on when it sucked, I never wanted to leave.
Where was this that you started stand up?
I started stand up at T. Brett Hudson's open mic, Drink Till We're Funny, at the Damon Bards and Grill in Hunt Valley, Maryland, when I was a senior in college.
Where were you going to school at the time?
Towson University.
And what was your major?
Theater, minor in electronic media.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So the internet and...
Yeah, I figured I'm studying to be a performer. I should also study to the technical stuff too, learn how to make the thing.
Yeah.
And do the thing. Just have as much knowledge on both sides of the field.
Double threat.
Basically. Is kind of my MO. And then stand up became my third fret because I couldn't sing. And I started stand up after my last band fell apart. My friend went to school in Iowa for a while. We're still good friends. I had a major falling out with the bassist and the drummer, and I didn't have the confidence to go go acoustic and go solo.
Were you the lead singer?
I would sing a couple songs, but no.
No. Funny songs?
No. Serious like emo, early 20s emo kind of kid.
Yeah.
So the songs weren't great, the lyrics weren't great, but I wrote them myself and I was into it.
Sure. I still listen to a couple hardcore songs, but I like the I get to pump myself up every once in a while. I'll put on like a Pennywise Unknown Road or what else? Gorilla Biscuits, Start Today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you are looking for good hardcore, this band Knocked Loose, I've heard a lot of people saying are making hardcore awesome again.
Okay. Yeah.
I've been hearing a lot of good stuff about them, and I just got into a buddy introduced me to this Japanese metalcore band named Fact. Their stuff's very melodic, but it's very heavy in the drumming. The drummer is ridiculous. They broke up a few years ago, but their stuff's really good, and it's not too hard to find on like iTunes or YouTube.
I'll check it out.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
And how long have you been in stand up now?
I've been in stand up like 14 years, like a long time.
It's cool, man.
Yeah.
I feel like just staying in it is a victory at a certain point.
So it's cross training. You know, there's no like that longevity. I try to do something new that excites me every year.
Mm-hmm.
So last year I recorded an album. I recorded my first album.
Nice.
It was called Risky Behavior, and I spent like maybe 5 months preparing for it.
Mm-hmm.
Just trying to hit as many mics as possible.
Yeah.
And I did it all workshopping the material in New York City. So none of it was, stuff that I'd done on the road. I'm not like a huge road comic.
Right.
So I really broke it down into 5 to 10 minute increments, and then cobbled together an hour.
Uh-huh.
And I recorded that at the Secret Loft last year. And then after I recorded it, I got a 800-pound gorilla to put it out.
Oh, that's cool.
So that felt like a real big, victory. And if I quit tomorrow, I did that.
Yeah. Yeah, they do tons of stuff. They do everybody's comedy album. They I think they put out the album version of Kathleen Madigan's, and I think they're doing Samantha Ruddy's album also.
Yeah, they've got a great catalog of material of artists and albums, and it feels good to be in such good company.
Absolutely. What were you gonna say?
Well, and so it's like stand up or whatever. People talk about, comedy, but comedy is such a big umbrella term, and stand up's just one part of it. And there's so many other skills to pick up and ways to keep it fun. So this last week, I was in a run of a play. So I did a play last week where I got to play. The play was called The Magnificent Murder Magic Show, and it was written by Jerry Burgos, who I know from the Story Pirates, and my friend Joanna Simmons directed it. But doing that, I got to dance, I got to play a little kid, I got to play an older man who speaks Spanish. So it was like just always expanding your skill set is important in this, and trying new things, because you never know. It's very easy to say this is my goal, but it really is it's like a winding stream rather than a straight line.
I agree with that. Wholeheartedly. One more thing I want to ask you. This will be a good way to close it out here.
Sure.
Gabe, I want to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly. Pacheco?
That's right.
Excellent. What are you going to do next year? What's going to be you record an album. What's going to be the thing you do next year?
Oh, next year I want to have I've got a raft of sketches that mostly I have the premises. I've got it in my head, and I'd really like to pitch to write a pilot for a sketch show and pitch that and get it seen by industry.
Awesome, man.
Yeah.
Excellent. And you got the sketches. Are you gonna have auditions and line people up, or you got a crew? You got your crew?
So I have I've got a couple different projects that I put out online where I've done them all before finding any eyes to see them. One was a short film called Leaves in Autumn, and in that it's filled with brilliant comedians. So like John Moses, I cast John Moses in it, Ian Fidance, Carrie Caudette, Amber Rollo, Carrie Gravenson, and my friend Andrew Gollidge directed that. But the thing is with this pilot, what I think I'd like to do is write the whole thing out, but then just film one or two of the sketches, and then say, all right, if you guys are interested, let's get some funding to make the rest of these happen.
Excellent. Well, I think you're gonna get it done, man. I get that. I have that kind of that vibe of accomplishment that coming off of you.
Oh, I'm not one of those Instagram wake and grind, rise and grind type dudes, but persistence. That's what it's all about. Just one foot in front of the other every day.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to live, great way to create, and a great way to close this out, man. This was a great chat. It was great because I haven't seen you in years.
I know this feels wonderful. I'm glad I got to come to your neighborhood. Glad I got to see where you live, your habitat.
Yes,
and it's been so fun talking to you today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gabe.
Thanks, Will.
Okay, folks, that's our show. That was my conversation with Gabe Pacheco. If you enjoyed listening to Gabe, you can check out his podcast, Eat, Pray, Judge, available wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, Gabe, for your time, and I appreciate you coming over. And I also want to give a shout out to my supporter on Patreon at the awesome producer level, Mary Beth Mooney. Thank you so much for your support. You're awesome, and I think you're pretty great, and I appreciate the support on that platform. If you guys want to check out the exclusive things that I'm doing over on Patreon that I'm not posting anywhere else, you can go to patreon.com/awesomedisaster. Check that out. See if anything there tickles your fancy. One of the things I'm doing over there is making custom mixtapes for patrons. So if you want to check that out, I can make that happen for you. that's been our show for this week. I'm gonna keep drinking my tea and try to get my voice back to its normal kind of squeaky smoothness, as opposed to the like late night, all right, kind of smoothness. But if you enjoyed this show, we are available wherever you get your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can subscribe, leave reviews on those platforms. I would greatly appreciate it. And I'm on Twitter at Comic Will Carey. You can follow me there. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you next week between Awesome and Disaster. Take care, everybody.